Today we're covering a number of topics related to getting you going on your planning journey. So this is, I'll get to the agenda, which I think you've seen, but this is really where we start watching the rubber hit the road. I think that we went over this last time, but we always start webinars just with a reminder about how to be fully effective and present using virtual video technology. I'm getting over a cold, so I'm going to try very hard not to keep hacking in your ear. If I start coughing, I'll mute myself and would ask the same of you. And just remember also that there's a community chat box so that if we're in the middle of something and you want to make a comment or not forget that you have a question, use the chat box. But also, this is meant to be interactive, and so please jump in with questions or comments, and we will listen for that. Okay, Barbara actually introduced herself last time, but just really quickly, the people who are here today, I wanted to make sure you guys have a chance to say hi. So I said hi already. Gwen, you want to say good morning?
Good morning, this is Gwen. I'm in Nashville, Tennessee.
Great. I should say I'm in Wyoming, but I'm in southeast Wyoming, and it's weirdly 47 degrees outside, so hoping it snows again soon. Alex is with us doing, making sure things are running smoothly in the background. Alex, you want to say hi quickly?
Howdy, all.
Hey. And then Sarah, the gal, our intern who wrote the brief for you all, actually was able to join us as well. So Sarah, do you want to just really briefly say hi?
Sure. Hi. I'm actually based in D.C.
And remind me what you're studying.
I am no longer studying, actually. I graduated.
Oh, that's right. Right.
But
your area of specialty is?
It's natural resource management and climate change.
Great. Good. So she's been a great extra pair of expertise hands for us. And Barbara is joining us from Colorado. You want to say hi quickly?
Hi, all. I'm Barbara Cousins. I'm based in Lyons, Colorado, which is just outside Rocky Mountain National Park.
Great. Okay. And we have a few more people from our organization. I'm going to let them say hi in the chat box because I'm going to go ahead and jump in. So we wanted to be sure that we regrounded ourselves collectively in why we're here. So so these are just a couple slides sort of rooting you in the purpose and the why of the work that you're doing. So working towards thriving communities with healthy people, forests, waters, farms, businesses, and economic stability. There are a number of different ways that you can get from here to there. And then there's also a number of ways that you can measure getting here from there. So these are some of the outcomes that some of the communities we've worked with have focused on. You will, in later sessions, come up with your own. But just to ground the conversation. So today, we have a few minutes to start to explore changing conditions in Madison County. I know you may or may not have had a chance to review the material that we sent out that Sarah put together. But we'll start that conversation and then also start to continue to ground the MFCP team, at least in the context in which you all are living and working. And then we're going to dive into the nuts and bolts. So we'll cover an overview of the next, whatever it is, 9 or 10 months. We'll talk a bit about the nuts and bolts of continuing to build your team and pulling in advisors and stakeholders. Alex is very quickly going to give you an overview of the virtual learning tools and platforms that we use. In the interest of time, we decided yesterday that she would give a really quick overview and then a recording that walks people through more in depth. So we'll make that recording available. And then Gwen is going to share a case study of a community that she's intimately familiar with, but that MFPP worked with in depth in 2010. And then we'll give you some homework. So here we go, changing conditions. I'm not going to, this is going to be a much more extensive conversation next time, but just briefly in terms of extreme weather, changing weather patterns, we're seeing this happen all over the country. Where I live in Wyoming, I think is similar to Idaho in that we're seeing less snowpack, drier, hotter summers, a lot more wildfire and a lot more unpredictability in our wildfire. There's a lot of regional variation, but these different patterns are playing out across the country. Sarah did some initial research into Madison County, and these are some of the highlights of the trends and changes she's seen in the research. So we all who live in the Intermountain West know that water is of concern, so that impacts agriculture, consumers, and hydropower. There's changing patterns in floods, so a lot of us are experiencing, including Madison County, more spring floods, drier summers, again, fire risk. There's a lot of human health effects to some of these changing patterns, which we'll dive into in much greater depth, but suffice it for now to say that this disproportionately impacts populations like the elderly, who have much higher incidence of lung and heart cardiovascular disease, and so they're more vulnerable. And then there are these other recreational impacts. I know your part of the world draws people for fishing, for just to the east of you, skiing, snowmobiling, and so there's some changes happening there. And then you're an ag community, and so a lot of agricultural concerns and impacts. Some are of concern, and some are potentially beneficial. So things like, the drought impacts on crop yields and crop viability is a really big deal. On the flip side, and I'll show a graph in a second, there's longer growing seasons that might bring in new possibilities for new or different crops or crop yields. I pulled two graphs. We'll be asking you to do much more extensive research using this and other tools. But I pulled two graphs and Sarah had included these in her paper to highlight some of the trends we're seeing. This one is the projected number of days over 95 degrees Fahrenheit starting now and going out about 100 years. And what you see in terms of variation is models based on different emission scenarios. So it's pretty big variation, but also Laramie, like I think where you live, has a really wonderful climate in the summer, and I look at those increase in 90-degree days and I think, oh my goodness, that's really unpleasant. So increasing trends no matter the scenario there. And then this is a graph similarly using different emission scenarios to project the number of growing degree days. So this is a graph that tends to really hit home for people working in ag or ranchers or allied industries. So what we wanted to give you a few minutes to just reflect on together, and you can also take these questions and have more extensive conversations outside of this call. The first is whether with those few graphs that I just shared or with the longer document that Sarah drafted, if there are clarifying questions you have about the data that you're seeing. And I'm going to pause there and see if that brings up anything for anybody. Annalisa or Robert, any clarifying questions? No. Okay, not so far. Okay, Lance, does this bring up any questions for you? Okay. So what, as you've started to think about changing conditions, changing patterns, what are your reactions to some of what you've been reading about or listening to? I don't know. I think I think it rings true as far as just anecdotally. I think the warmer summers and longer growing seasons. Just for what people talk about. For what their experience and what they say they had growing up here and things, and then as far as living here the last several years, I think it has gotten longer. I remember moving here and people saying, planting gardens and crops and things, saying like, oh yeah, anything past Labor Day is borrowed time for having hard frost, and that's not the case. But definitely, it is a longer growing season just in that. So I think we are seeing that effect for sure. So it's aligned with stories you've heard and observations you've made so far.
Yeah.
Well, the same goes for your data on our snowpack.
Yeah.
We're getting less snowpack. And also,
Yeah.
this is more in my realm, the increase in the wildfires. The last 3 or 4 years, we've seen more fires in our area impacting our county than we've seen in the 16 years that I've been here.
Yeah, yeah, and I know, here we had some really bad fires last year, and there's both the proximity of the fire and how severe they were, but then the human health impacts from the smoke. You couldn't see across the street some days, and it was pretty hard on our lungs. Great. So I know this is a snapshot, and I know that you're going to be doing a much deeper dive. Did reading the paper, doing your preliminary research, make you think about areas that you really want to focus on in your work? What are the implications for your work over the next year? You can put a pin on it if you want to think about it more.
I think I read over the brief today, and
Oh, great.
yeah, I think it was eye-opening. I mean, things that I hadn't thought of as far as, with the longer growing season. I hadn't thought of, I've thought a lot of in terms of water conservation and things agriculturally, also, just with the municipalities and things, but I hadn't thought of it in terms of that does mean more chemically, fertilization and pest control and things like that, that with longer growing season, there's more potential use for that and how that's going to be affecting our environment as well. And I've been thinking in terms of, with temperature and stuff, like more of the cold weather things, but we were talking yesterday, Lance had mentioned how there's been more pest problems, that, introduction of another pest that we haven't seen on our crops, but in recent years we're starting to see that. And so I hadn't considered that, like with the warmer weather, that those are issues that we need to consider. I was thinking more in terms, again, of water and flooding and freezing, those things, how that was affecting it. But yeah, I hadn't thought of like, oh, yeah, people are going to be using more fertilizer or more often, or applying, weed control or pest control, more applications, and how that might be, again, that could be affecting our aquifer or our, but our air quality, things like that. But I hadn't taken that into account. So that's another road to maybe explore that I hadn't been considering. So
definitely, yeah. Robert or Lance, Lance, you're just joining us and getting caught up, but other implications for this work of that you're embarking on?
Lance, you mentioned yesterday some new invasive insects that are coming in, the thrips you mentioned. Is that one of many, or?
That's what we've heard of so far. So we're looking into that, finding out better ways to manage that. So we have thrips, and they've always kind of been around here in Idaho. They've just moved from one type of crop to another, is what they're doing. So they generally don't feed on grains, but they're moving over to grains. So it's more of an adaptation that these insects they've just adapted, and they're moving on to a different kind of crop. And they generally don't do that. So that's part of what we're seeing. So but they just started doing they're going to be doing some research over the next little bit on that to see the impact that they're having economically and what options there are to take care of that problem. So.
Right. Gotcha. Well, that's a great segue to the next question, which we'll continue to ask you about. But as a first pass, what do you want or need to learn more about as you move into the risk assessment? And Elise, it sounded like there were a whole new set of topics and issues and concerns that you hadn't thought about that are probably on your list. What else is really burning for you at this point in terms of moving into your risk assessment?
Well, I think in general, I mean, this is just brought up the question of, you know, we haven't had quite some of the issues. You know, I was thinking about like some of the disease problems, like with insects. I'm just wondering if things are getting warmer, if we start having more of a problem like with mosquitoes or with things like that, that we haven't had as many issues like with some of those kinds of things, like that have been problems. I know, like further south in Utah, for instance, where they've had spread of. I remember it being an issue when I did live in Utah, that concerns that I had neighbors who contracted West Nile virus, for instance. We haven't had that issue here. We don't have that even for pets, like heartworm. You don't worry about it here, but when we took our dog to Utah, we had to have him treated ahead of time. So I was like, is that going to be more of a concern in Idaho, in our area? That's just something just off the top of my head, where we're seeing that kind of thing. I don't know if that's something that we would necessarily have the resources to explore, but I know we definitely do want to learn more about just this weekend where we had a lot of snow, and then it warmed up just a few degrees, and now it's turning into rain and melting. And so I know flooding is a big concern for people residentially, and also the floodplain around the rivers and things. That's definitely going to be a high priority for us to study, learn more about. And so where we're having the fluctuation in temperatures a lot more at the beginning and end of winters, where it goes back and forth a lot more instead of the gradual lead in and out. And so I know that's definitely, in addition to like water conservation, that's something I'm really interested in. But you know that those are all relevant, important topics. I'm going to keep us moving, but I just want to mention that these questions I shared now, because a lot of times when I'm facilitating dialogues with communities where scientific information has been shared and I want to give them a chance to discuss it, these are actually 4 or 5 questions that I use to walk a group through. So asking them, you know, make sure they understand the information that's been presented, asking for initial reactions, asking them to think about how it matters, and then what they want to know more about, can just be a really nice way to frame a community conversation. So, so that is why I shared those questions here. I'm going to touch on this with the understanding that this is going to be a 10-month conversation between MFPP and all of you, your team and your advisors. But we wanted to also take a few minutes and have you help us learn a little bit about Madison County and some of the really important values and principles, community gathering places that make it what it is. And so I just wanted to pause for a few minutes, and the broad question is just, what is it important for us to understand about the communities that make up Madison County, and what really drives people? So if any of you have any initial thoughts on that topic, again, that'll be a ongoing conversation, and one of the assignments you'll have is to provide some more in-depth feedback on that question. But Robert, Annalisa, or Lance, if you have any immediate reflections on that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, well, I know we talked a lot last time. We had people here from the university, and so the university is a big driver of growth here, and so and I think there's a big love relationship. There's some animosity sometimes, I think, with the students. Sometimes people feel like, you know, the students come in and they, you know, they make it crowded, and then they, you know, they're young and they don't have a lot of ownership of the community, and they just come and make things busy and crowded, and then they leave, and they, and so I think some of the talk of having partnership with having students come do some of these projects and some of this research and stuff could be a good thing in that way.
Is that relationship partly or largely about is it kind of a classic town gown thing where there's maybe conflicts around land use or traffic or student behavior, or is it?
Everything. I mean, for a college town, the students are pretty well behaved. I mean, where they're not having drunk parties and loud, so it really could be a lot worse. But there is kind of that, like, oh, it's the students, the students are, making it crowded at the grocery stores, and the students take up all the parking spots, and there's kind of that sort of thing. But I think there's also, that were it not for the university, there wouldn't be a lot of the businesses and things that we do enjoy here. So I think you kind of have to, that sometimes some people do recognize that, and some people are just like, oh, it's the students, So we recognize that. So I think we have a great opportunity having a lot of expertise with the university here and the resources that the university brings. And so what visibility there could be with students contributing with this could be a good thing.
Right.
And overall,
that's really helpful.
I think overall people do appreciate having the university here.
Yes.
But
I totally, as a resident of a university small town that doesn't teach on campus, I know I live the good, the bad, and the ugly. What about some of the other community anchors? So institutions like the church that provide faith and community anchor, or how people interact with or use the natural environment. Anything else today that you want to share or muse on that'll help us?
So I think you have the faith community. It's largely communities in Madison County, so Sugar City and Rexburg. There traditionally have been faith-based communities. There is not a big shift, but there is also another demographic that's moving into the area. At least I've seen, as I've worked on the ambulance and fire truck for 16 years before, that there's more of a separate demographic that isn't the same group that's moving in because they like the area. I've met a couple from Florida.
Who are not necessarily members
of the LDS faith.
Church.
Yeah, so they're bringing in a different demographic with them. It's a small minority, but there is a little bit of a shift there as well.
But definitely the LDS Church, which is also BYU Idaho, is run by the LDS Church. So there's some big overlap there. There's, as far as ethnic diversity, not a lot, but there is some there, and so that's one thing that does get overlooked, I think.
Do you guys get immigrants or migrant farm workers coming to work on ranches and farms in Madison County?
There is a Latino community here that I think does get overlooked, and people assume that it's predominantly white, and so therefore there's not a lot of outreach. But yeah, there is, and maybe a little bit more in rural areas. But yeah, I think.
Gotcha.
It's the Latino population is still less than 10%. It's actually quite lower than that. One of the other things too is Madison County as a whole benefits more from agriculture than it does from any other entity it's an ag-based community, and that's where all the income comes from, is from all the agriculture that happens here. And I think that gets overlooked a lot of times because people see the university where they don't necessarily, BYU Idaho, they don't see the agriculture that's actually happening out there, and that's what brings in the money.
I don't
to this area.
The county as a whole, since I live right in the middle of Rexburg, and and so I don't think of it that way because I see Rexburg. So it's good for me to be aware of that, and when I do drive around to realize how much of it is agricultural.
That's And that's where, you know, a lot of this planning needs to be centered around how do we make sure that these farms are still viable farms in the future, because that's, you know, that's what this community is sustained on, not necessarily solely upon the university. I mean, the university brings half of the population here. Unfortunately, a lot of those students can't work, and I say don't work because they can't, because there's not a whole lot of businesses out there as far that would provide them employment that would be feasible for them based off of their school schedules. But a lot of what we need to think about is that agricultural business and how changes in weather affect that part of the community because of the amount of, you know, amount of importance they have economically to the city of Rexburg, Thornton, Sugar City. I mean, that's what's keeping everything going here around here is the agriculture that we have.
One last question before we move on. I'll make sure Gwen and everyone has a chance to ask too. But when it comes to, you know, planning around natural resources or environmental issues, how big a role does the church play in participating or shaping those processes? Does that make sense? So is it just through church members, or do they play an institutional role?
I would say an institutional role. I think it's more just the people who are members of the community. But I think people around here value it. A lot of people value, you know, hunting and fishing around here, as well as the recreational, you know, skiing is really big, cross country and downhill skiing, and so I think people do appreciate it and like to be involved in various ways, but it's just individual members of the community and however they're involved, whether participating or whatever, or in actual employment capacity.
Okay. Yeah, that helps me a lot. Gwen or Sarah, Barb, do you have any quick questions before we move on?
This is really helpful for me. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess just one quick question. If you were gonna try to convince a family member to move there, what would you say? What would be the things that you would say? This is what I absolutely love about being here.
From some of the people I've talked to, what's brought them to the area is either employment or the small town community feel that we've been able to maintain, and then also the centralized area that we are towards recreation out. So we have the sand dunes that are in Fremont County to the north of us. We're in close proximity to Yellowstone National Park. We have Teton National Park to the west, and then we have some smaller mountain ranges in our county.
Yeah, there's Harriman State Park that's close.
Island
Park. Yeah, so, I mean, I think for our family, you know, we'll go and visit family in bigger cities and stuff, and we like coming back, which surprised us to live in a small town environment where, you know, we can walk places or we can, you know, run errands, and it's not an all-day big ordeal. It's, you know, everything. I mean, people complain like, oh, traffic's so bad. We don't have traffic here, you know. You can drive anywhere within 5 minutes if you need to, and it's so we've been surprised how much we do like it, smaller, slower, small town feel, even though you do miss not having all the big restaurants and shops. That sometimes that's overwhelming now, going to big towns. And so it is nice to have that, but yeah.
Another aspect they speak about is we do have crime, but our crime rate is lower because of that value system that flows underneath the community that we were talking about previous. So even though we do have our crime, we do have our drug abuse, we do have our the common denominators that every community has, it seems to be at a lesser rate and
Yeah.
it's managed well.
I mean, the town motto is it's the family community or something like that. The
America's family community.
America's family community. Yeah. So a lot of people like that it's a good family place to raise kids and, you know. So.
Now I want to move there.
It's a
And not
good
unlike my
town.
town.
Montana, so.
Yeah, it's nice. And it is, like you're saying, the winters can be brutal, but we do have a nice spring and summer are pretty nice. It is getting hotter in the summers, though. When we moved here, people are like, oh, you're not going to need an air conditioner. You need an air conditioner more and more during the summer, which is something I was thinking about with more and more days over 95 degrees. You know, with the building, we had people here on the building committees and building and zoning, but yeah, that is more of an issue.
Yeah. In Wyoming, we say that the wind in our winter keeps the Californians and the Texans away. So, you know, we're okay. And no offense to Californians or Texans on the call. Okay, we're going to continue to have this conversation over the next 10 months. And so thank you for beginning it with us. We're going to turn to cover some of the overview of the next 10 months. So, Gwen, this is you.
All right. So thank you for that discussion. That's really helpful, and I'm looking forward to continuing that dialogue. But right now, considering our overarching goal to bring greater resilience to the communities there and all the wonderful things about it, I'm going to just go through quickly what that looks like to give you a sense of how we organize the process and the training approach that we use to work in concert with all of you there. This is an overview of the steps in the process. As we go through a planning process, we're in the process now of step 1, activating that local team. And we'll be, in our next session, we'll be moving into assessing the risks and concerns. Then the identification of solutions and opportunities to help address those risks that are identified. And that will include different ways to analyze and prioritize both the risks and the solutions. And all of that will get folded into an action plan to implement those solutions. And then it's important that it doesn't stop at that point. There's also the monitoring and evaluation of how the solutions are working, making adjustments, reassessing, and then continuing to take action. So it's a circular, ongoing cycle, and we're plugging in at a point in that cycle, but it's always an ongoing thing. But it's just good to have a sense of how we're organizing the process. And I sent you this one-page syllabus in brief to give you a sense of how we've organized the topics as a preliminary curriculum, recognizing that we try to keep our curriculum responsive to what your priority concerns are and how the discussions go in terms of identifying solutions. So it will be somewhat fluid. This is our starting point. And it's a step-by-step process, so that it's not overwhelming. We just take it a little at a time, make it manageable. There will be 23 live sessions, typically on the 2nd and 4th Tuesday of each month, with a few changes for particular schedule conflicts. We will try, in most cases, to have a bit of a alternating focus. There'll be a session that's more educational, maybe more presentations, and then there'll be a session that's more of a working session, more interactive and dialogue and working on problems together. And it'll have a natural flow to it. We'll have lots of worksheets and tools for use as we go through the process. And then we'll have a starting outline for what that final report or plan can look like. But that will be for you guys to finalize, depending on what works in terms of it's your plan. Ultimately, we're facilitating a process here, but it's for you to own the process and own the results. So that's really core to excuse me, to what we do is facilitating a manageable process and not doing it all for you, but assisting everywhere we can. And community engagement is a huge part of that. We'll be including different ways of public outreach and education all along the way. In the end, there'll be an action plan with very clear objectives to help increase resilience and especially increase the health and safety of the members of the community and your natural resources. And the added bonus here, of course, is that adding those recommendations to enhance the comprehensive plan, the hazard mitigation plan, and the economic development plan, and integrate the FEMA information into all of that mix. So there's a lot of coordinating that will be going on. This is just a snapshot of the training modules as we've organized them and the number of sessions in each one. And you'll see that we're putting a heavy emphasis on the solutions. That's where we'll spend most of our time in 3 and 4 here, is identifying solutions and what are the good things that we want to make happen to achieve your goals. And then in the final end will be the documents that we come up with and the enhancements to the other plans and presentation materials that can be beneficial going forward. This is a quick snapshot of what that schedule looks like. You'll notice that there's overlap in every stage. Even though we'll move into solutions as the topic, every time you're looking at solutions, you're also considering what's the underlying risk that you're trying to solve. So there's a lot of overlap. And you'll notice that community outreach here extends from one end to the other for the whole year. There'll always be steps to engage the community in every stage of the process. Our webinars will be twice a month. We will have additional conference calls if needed. That'll be based on what's decided from your need point, and lots of tools to help along the way. And this is just a reminder that these sessions, these live sessions that we have, are not the main event, really. The main event is what happens between those sessions. The work that goes on locally with your team and within your community with partners, that's where the real happening is. This is the jumping off point. And because the main event is there with you and your team, wanted to just touch base on the team member roles. We're in the activating the team process right now, and that will be ongoing. But again, the providing community outreach is a big part of that throughout. There's participation in the live sessions. There's working on the worksheet planning steps, gathering information, analyzing that information, making choices as a team about what your priorities are, what your choices are for what's feasible. So there'll be time devoted to those tasks, and part of your role, Annalisa, with Sharon, will be understanding the strengths of your team and delegating those activities so that no one person is overtaxed and everything still gets done. And we'll be aiming towards having a written report or plan by December, and recommendations to the other plans as those can be made along the way. And we'll be talking a little more about how we'll coordinate with those other planning processes. So just to reinforce, the most critical element in this curriculum, in the process, is you, the people of Madison County, and all of those wonderful values that you are working to protect. Let me stop there and ask if there's any questions. I know I've run through that very quickly. Any comments or questions about what you just heard in terms of how the learning program is structured? Is this sort of what you had in mind, or is this surprising?
No, I think,
Does it make sense?
yeah.
Okay, very good. Well, we're always open to suggestions and questions along the way, so please. What I didn't mention is that in our live sessions, we do like to structure them as a co-teaching environment. So with almost every session, there will be information that you're gathering in the meantime, and we'll ask you to bring that to the next meeting so that each of you is reporting back to the group at large and to us on what you're learning and what your decisions are. So it'll be a shared session when we're together. We'll be hearing from you, and you'll be hearing from us.
Okay.
And I'll turn it back over to Deb now to talk more about the team aspects of that.
Okay. This is one of my favorite topics, and I'll be the fly in your ear if flies could talk, saying, what about your advisors? What about your stakeholder engagement? That'll be me. Excuse me. So when we talk about sort of having a core team, having a broader network of advisors, and then community engagement, it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people or communities, and you guys will come up with an approach and a plan that makes sense for you. So what I'm about to share is one way of thinking about it that we've seen work well, and then a couple of tools that you can use to start to think strategically about building things out at each of these 4 levels. So here is sort of a concentric circle. It's not a Venn diagram. I was going to say Venn diagram. And at the heart of it is your core team. So as you've quickly learned, the core team is the motor, the workhorse that makes everything go. So this is the small group of people, including you guys, who attends these meetings, coordinates communications, does the writing, does the editing, does the outreach, or works with other people to make it happen. In terms of size, this is really up to you, but what I've seen work best is groups of, say, 5 to maybe 8 people, give or take, just because you want it to be small enough that it's easy, you can be nimble and flexible, it's not impossible to schedule meetings, but big enough that you have enough people to get the work done. And then your advisors, this is up to you to think about, but there is a lot more wisdom and knowledge and people who are willing to pitch in your broader community than you can have or want on your core team. So this might be people who have expertise in stream science, or it might be people who have expertise in pests and agriculture and crops, or any number of things. But they're people who you want to invite in to advise you and give you feedback and maybe do specific research projects on specific topics in a more time-limited way. And they're also a group you probably want to keep in the loop as you move forward. So more targeted than stakeholders, but less of a workhorse than your core team, but just as important. The broader group of key stakeholders and community really kind of, I almost put them in the same circle, but these are groups of people who are going to be impacted positively or negatively in some way by the work that you're doing and by the risks that you're exploring. And so it's really important to understand how to tease out who the key stakeholders are, and then think about a variety of ways to engage them in your process throughout the process. So for example, the farmers and ranchers in your community are going to be crucial, and so thinking about that as a key stakeholder group and thinking about places or organizations through which they already gather and share might be one way to mobilize them. So it's one way to think about it. By the same token, when you start to think about your community, community isn't a monolithic thing, and so it can help to think about, well, one of the important communities in Madison County is the LDS Church, and so how do we want to engage the church community in the work that we're doing? The students at the university might be a really important kind of subgroup, and you want to do some thinking about that, because then you can have more focused, nuanced conversations based on sort of sub-communities and what risks they might be most interested in or exposed to, and ideas they might have about solutions. So thinking about this in kind of concentric circles can be helpful. in terms of your core team, I know you've already started thinking about this. One of your tasks in the next week is going to be to think about who do you have on board already, and are there any gaps that you need to fill pretty quickly so that you can really continue to hit the ground running. So questions that we would typically ask would include who can make the time commitment is maybe the most important thing. And then there are going to be skills that you want to have be part of your workhorse team. So project management skills, I think you already have some excellent project managers on board. Is there someone who has facilitation skills that you can make use of both for your meetings and maybe with community meetings? Writing and editing skills, data analysis, mapping, communications. There's a lot of things that you might want to think about, but making a list of what work has to happen and do you have someone who can make sure it gets done is an important step. And then this question of linking your planning process to implementation. It's a great idea to have someone on your core team who can, when your planning process ends, really seamlessly become the champion for making sure the plan moves forward. And also, we know that one of the critical things for you guys is that there's these other planning processes happening in sync or almost in sync with what you're doing. And so are there people on your core team who can act as liaisons with other planning processes or who can take a lead on integration with some of the other plans? So Robert, if having an emergency manager on the core team is great because of the link, explicit link to hazard mitigation planning. And there might be other considerations that you have when you think about your core team. We've provided you with a template to help you do sort of a pass-through to take a look at your core team. This is a snapshot of it. And Annalise, I'm sorry, I didn't know who your organizational affiliation was, so that's blank, not because I think less of you, I just didn't know. So I threw in a couple people I already know are on your core team. And so you need a project lead, you need some people who can manage the project, and then some other things. And then what you want is whatever skills or roles you think are crucial, you want to make sure that somebody's assigned to do that. So this is just a super simple template to facilitate that exercise. That's one of the pieces of homework you have. And because things start moving really, really quickly, it's great to solidify your core team pretty quickly if you haven't already. Not the focus of your homework in the coming week, but it's never too soon to start thinking about those broader circles. This worksheet is very similar, but it asks you to think about those broader circles, so in particular stakeholders and different communities that make up Madison County. And so if you have bandwidth and want to get going on this worksheet as well, you'll have it. But it asks you to think about what are the categories of advisors and stakeholders that you want to make sure you're engaging, and put in a specific name or organization and think about at what level do you want to engage them. There'll be a future step where it asks you also to think about how much authority or influence do individual people have over the final decision-making process. And there's a couple others more sort of strategic questions in there. So don't worry too much about this in the next week or two, but it's available for you if you're ready to get going on it. And then there's some nuts and bolts, as you guys know, about just running a team. So talking about how often are you going to meet and for how long, how are you going to communicate with each other in between meetings, how are you going to share files. We have some suggestions about that. And anything else that you need to sort of solidify to make sure that you're working well together will be part of that conversation. And so you'll get a worksheet after today's session that'll include both some tools and then some questions that get at a number of those different issues. So I'll pause there and see if there's any questions or comments on that.
Do you want us to fill that out individually, like each of us fill that out, or do you want us to do that like collaboratively?
I think it's best, it's really up to you guys, but I think it works best if it's collaborative because each of you is going to know people and have ideas about what's important. And so having that group conversation will be probably the most useful. If you don't have a meeting scheduled in the next couple of weeks and you want to do it by email, it'll actually be a Google Doc so you can collaborate on it virtually. Okay. Is also, it's workable. But what matters is that you really get going on it.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yes. Yeah. I just
Okay.
was thinking, if we have different ideas for who might fill those roles, or it might be helpful to collaborate.
Yeah. Having the most important thing is that we have more than once seen someone who's a champion of a process like this think that they can do it by themselves, and they can't. You just flat out can't. It's too much, and also you get such a better outcome if it's collaborative, because all of this stuff is complicated and interrelated. And so the most important thing is that you have the people around the table to do the work that you need pretty quickly.
Okay.
And it might change over time. But.
Sure.
And if you have questions, I'm available, so you can shoot me an email and say, oh, we're really stuck on, and this is true for any of the homework that you have, but please feel free to reach out to me, and we can talk through it more.
Okay.
All right. Alex is going to quickly run through the virtual learning pieces, and then there'll be a more detailed thing after today. So Alex.
All right, so we're running short on time, so this is going to be the whirlwind tour, but hopefully you guys are relatively familiar with many of these tools that we're using. We've already started with our systems of virtual collaboration, which rely strongly on webinars. Our webinars are meant to be interactive and participatory. We're looking for you guys to be co-presenters of information. And hopefully we're facilitating shared learning within your planning team outside the webinars. In terms of making it to webinars, just make sure you're aware of the time zones. Sometimes that gets a little confusing since we've got, 20 people in 4 different time zones. So just be aware of that. Adobe Connect is pretty straightforward. I don't know if y'all are familiar with it or not, but we'd love for y'all to share your webcams. That's going great today. You'll see up at the top of the screen the place to mute your speakers if you're getting an echo or feedback. And you will be able to share your screen or documents as needed. Often the easiest way to do that is to share a document. So we can let you upload that into the system. You can send it to me in advance of the webinar, and I'll upload it for you. But you will be able to share content as you need to. We will also be setting up an online classroom for you, and this is basically just a central repository. This is where we're going to put the slides and the recordings from these webinar sessions. We will post worksheets and stuff like that we want you to have easy access to. And what we'll do is we'll set up logins for y'all and send those to you when that site is ready to go. And then file sharing, we are sort of using the basics that we hope folks are relatively familiar with. We use Google Docs and Dropbox very heavily. Google Docs specifically for documents where we want people to be able to do collaborative editing in other words, 20 people being able to access and edit the file at the same time. We'll upload a little how-to document in your Google folder just in case you're not familiar with collaborative editing in Google, and hopefully that'll get you familiarized. So what will happen is we will set up these folders in Google Docs and Dropbox. We're going to ask Bradley or one of you to send us an email list with the email addresses you will be using to access these. If you don't have a Google account, you can set up a Google account with any email. It doesn't have to be a Gmail, but you do need to have a Google account. So once we get those lists of your preferred emails, we will send you invites to all of that so you can access everything there. And as you're moving forward, you're going to be placing all kinds of collected information into these file locations and so forth. So just a reminder, because sometimes we get to the end of the process, we're trying to get everything drafted up, and then we realize we don't know where we found this information. So be sure to remember to track all the sources of information and data you're finding, because it's really a pain to lose track of those. Maintain those full citations. And when you're working with graphics, whether it's photos or tables or charts, track those sources as well. Make sure there's no copyright restrictions so that you can use them in your final documents, and make sure you've got stuff in high resolution so that it's useful in final documents. So again, the online classroom will be sending you guys your own custom logins for those. Dropbox and Google Docs, you can go ahead and set up an account, and then you will get an invite to our shared folders. I think that's it. And again, we'll provide more details. Yes?
Any quick questions for Alex? Any quick questions for Alex, or are you guys good to go? Okay. I think I got a wave. I think I see a wave. So one of the great questions that you had last time was to hear from some of our communities that we've worked with, about their planning processes, their results, their success stories. And so what we're going to do is try to make room in each session for a look at one community. So it's going to be short and sweet this time. We'll probably revisit this one periodically because it's in my own backyard, so to speak. We're going to talk a little bit about Sumner County, Tennessee. So Sumner County is a rural county right on the edge of Nashville. So it has sprawl development impacting it. It sits just to the northeast of Nashville along the Tennessee-Kentucky border. And they participated, the county itself and the county planner participated in our first full year of the curriculum in 2010. They were one of 6 communities that were part of that cohort that year that were working together doing planning for their county. It was the local planner who led the process, but he had a really great diverse team with a lot of different organizations and businesses participating along with the government agencies. And it's really has a lot of parallels with what you're doing there now in Madison. They were also doing the comprehensive plan at the same time. And so their resilience team pretty much became the de facto natural resource subcommittee of the comp plan. And so they dug into not only the resilience, but the other aspects of natural resources as part of that process. And they dug into the issues that are extreme weather related, and they also dug into the issues that are non-climate related, like growth. And that's an important part of our process, is that we look at both those weather-related issues and also the non-weather-related issues, because they interact and they exacerbate each other. So the results of their risk assessment focused in on storms and floods as the main issue, the related public health impacts of heat and disease, and then population growth was an equally important risk factor for the impacts that they are and were seeing. During the planning year, in 2010, May of 2010, Middle Tennessee experienced a 1,000-year flood event that killed a lot of people and did over $2 billion worth of damage. And Sumner County was ground zero for a lot of that. This photo that you're seeing here was taken in Sumner County. And so that definitely influenced some of their decision making, having experienced that in May of 2010 during the planning process. In the very next year, in 2011, was a record year for tornadoes. There were literally hundreds of tornadoes across the southeast, and Tennessee had more than its share. So those kind of storms are also seem to be happening more frequently and more severely. The same with hurricanes. Those experiences are happening. So the focus of their resilience plan focused mainly on their natural resources as opposed to the urban areas, but recognizing the connections between the two. And so their main focus really was in how to mitigate against storms and floods. And that had to do with riparian zone protections and larger buffer zones and protecting the floodplains. They set goals for protecting the steep slopes. There's a ridge, about 100,000 acres of ridge territory that runs across the county that is forested, steep slope, primarily private landowner forested area that really needs protection from development for flood mitigation and many other reasons. And then they set a goal to try and increase the countywide tree canopy overall. They have been slowly implementing their recommendations. If you look at, so they had about a 100-page plan that they developed for adaptation, and then they have about a 300-page comp plan. And if you look at their comp plan, you'll see an 80-page chapter on cultural and natural resources that is pretty much drawn heavily from the adaptation plan. And then the implementation element in the comp plan contains the provisions to begin implementing these recommendations. And the things that they're working on now are various flood mitigation projects and flood buyout. One of the cities, the Gallatin, has recently instituted a stormwater authority to collect fees and be able to do stormwater retrofit projects and encourage more use of pervious surfaces. And they're just now updating their comp plan. It's been 10 years, and they are updating their comp plan, and they're reconsidering their urban growth boundaries and looking at reducing their urban growth boundaries and using conservation subdivision regulations as part of that. So all of those things have been flowing from the recommendations that came out in 2010 that they've been gradually trying to implement. And there's more information that we'll make available about this and many other case studies that we'll present through the year. But these are two documents that I think can serve as a reference for you as you're looking at what this process can look like for influencing a comp plan. And then the last thing is just to touch base about what's next. We will have our next webinar be 2 weeks from now, March the 12th, which will be the first Tuesday of March, or second Tuesday of March. And in the intervening time, there's a couple of homework assignments. The first is a questionnaire that's more of a personal questionnaire. We'll ask each of your team members to fill this out just so we begin to have a sense of getting to know each of you a little better and helping you think about your role on the team. And then there's our first worksheet to try and complete by Friday, March the 8th in advance of the next webinar. The things that worksheet includes, it includes looking at your current team list and analyzing it for strengths and gaps. It includes thinking about who the liaisons will be between the resilience planning and the other planning processes. Ideally, it would be great to have someone who is doing both for each plan to be the sort of the bridge, the informational bridge there. It'll also be looking at beginning to look at the risk assessment, which is what we'll be focusing on in the next webinar. There's some background reading around risk assessment, both in terms of the process and in what the risks are that have been written about specifically for Idaho and the Northwest. And some thinking about that and beginning to create an initial list of risks that you want to further dive into. So it's not a heavy workload in this first worksheet, but it's going to be important to walk through those steps. And the trick is to delegate those out. Not everyone needs to do them all. That's the beauty of putting the worksheet online as a collaborative document, sort of deciding who's going to do what. everybody does a little bit, and the document gets filled in for review next time. So we hope that you'll enjoy doing that. And I'll stop there and ask if there's any comments or questions about the next steps.
No, I think I will follow up with Bradley when he's back and make sure we get the worksheet that we're on top of that.
You bet.
And,
we'll send all that directly. We'll send it to Bradley, but copy you and Sharon,
okay.
Annalisa, and then you can, as the co-chairs, you can decide how you want to communicate with your team.
Okay.
But we'll make sure that it all gets in your hands, both the direct documents as well as links to where they are in the in Google folders or Dropbox.
Okay, great. Well,
I know that we're very excited about working with you. Thank you for hanging in there a little after the hour so that we could get through that with you. We'll also be sending you a set of PDF of the slides. The recording will be available in a few days for those who couldn't be with us today. And all of that will be accessible through the online classroom.
Okay, great.
All right. Well, have a wonderful rest of your week, everybody.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Deb.
You as well.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you all.